What would you do if you were standing in the middle of a courtroom where every pair of eyes mocked you, not because you lied, but simply because of the color of your skin, and because you dared to stand up for the truth? A 16-year-old boy, no lawyer, no one to defend him, left the entire courtroom in stunned silence with just two words. And the most shocking part? He wasn't lying. Would you believe that justice could come from a kid no one trusted? Before we dive into this extraordinary journey, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe justice must be fought for, no matter the cost, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because what's about to happen, you won't be able to look away. Sebastian Cole, a 16-year-old black teenager, stood motionless inside Northvale Courthouse, right in the center of a courtroom echoing with shrill laughter. Laughter that followed the life sentence handed down to his brother, Gabriel. No one noticed how tightly he clenched his skinny hands until they bled. No one cared that the suit he wore had been stitched together from 3 different secondhand pieces. But what they should have noticed and chose to ignore was the look in his eyes. Not fear, not hatred, but a silent vow. It won't end like this. Judge Everett Sinclair gave a small, satisfied nod, as if fate had just been sealed. They used to call him the quiet whip of Southwell Court, a man who delivered polite smiles while destroying the futures of black youth with a stroke of his gavel. And today he'd done it again, with Gabriel. While a jury of all white faces offered a round of condescending applause, Sebastian turned his head, locking eyes with his brother as he was being led away. Gabriel tried to smile, but Sebastian saw it, hidden in his eyes, an apology he couldn't say out loud. He remembered what their mother once told them. When you've got nothing left to lose, you still have one choice. Either bow your head or stand up for those who can't anymore. And right there, in the venomous silence of the courtroom, Sebastian made his choice. No one spoke for him. No one stood beside him. But still he stood, like a flickering candle in a room that had long embraced the dark. Because he knew, if he didn't act, no one ever would. Gabriel Vaughn, Sebastian's older brother and lifelong role model, had worked 2 shifts a day just to keep his little brother fed and in school. Yet somehow he was now being charged with murder, accused of killing a man during a scuffle near the Westridge Plaza parking lot. No weapon, no fingerprints, no credible witnesses, just one blurry security camera clip and the color of his skin. At the preliminary hearing, Judge Vincent Monroe, infamously known as the Iron Law of Norchester, declared, "No further defense is necessary. All the evidence points in one direction." But the direction he pointed toward wasn't built on facts. It was built on a pile of well-packaged prejudice. Monroe didn't care about the truth. What he wanted was a swift verdict to ease public pressure. Gabriel's court-appointed attorney, a man who hadn't won a major case in over 2 decades, nodded his way through the entire hearing. He didn't even bother to check the GPS log on Gabriel's phone, which could have proven he was at a convenience store 5 blocks from the scene. When Sebastian tried to bring it up, the lawyer waved him off and said flatly, "Kid, let the adults handle it." But the worst part? Their own community, neighbors, friends turned away. People whispered, there must have been a reason the cops arrested him. A sentence that would stay with Sebastian forever, because that sentence killed the last shred of trust he had left. In that moment, the 16-year-old realized, this wasn't just Gabriel's trial. This was a noose tightening around his own future, around his entire community's future, unless someone stood up to drag the truth into the light. And from that moment on, Sebastian was no longer just the little brother. He became the only one willing to stand against the entire system, alone. Judge Dominic Hayes, known for his bias and authoritarian rulings, never let the law get in the way of his prejudice. Even when inconsistencies in Gabriel Vaughn's case file began to surface, he pressed forward with a conviction, because to him, a black man in a hoodie couldn't possibly be innocent. What he didn't expect was that the boy sitting quietly in the back, Gabriel's 16-year-old brother, Sebastian, would not accept silence as a verdict. He had no power, no money for a lawyer, no one to guide him. But Sebastian had something the entire system had overlooked, a relentless mind, and a heart that refused to give up. After the trial, he showed up at the town library every single day, buried in legal books, scribbling down every clause related to appeal procedures. He didn't understand everything at first, but he kept learning. Each page became a spark of light cutting through the dark. Sebastian began rebuilding the entire timeline of the night of the incident, something the investigators had never bothered to do. He tracked every possible surveillance camera within a 5-kilometer radius. That's when he found it. An ATM security feed showing Gabriel buying a drink at the exact time the crime took place. Then came the detail no one noticed. A message buried in Gabriel's old phone from his best friend. Milk tea, same time as always? A message that had never been submitted to court. Sebastian printed it, walked straight into the office of the public defender who once dismissed him, and placed it on his desk. But what left people speechless was this. To retrieve the location data from that old messaging app, Sebastian had to sell his one and only bicycle, the same bike he rode to school every day, just to pay for the data access fee. Because to him, nothing was more valuable than the truth, and he was willing to give up everything to win it back. An all-white jury, heads nodding in unison, like the verdict had been decided long before the trial even began. Not a single one of them looked at the boy seated silently in the back row. They looked past him, as if he didn't even exist. But Sebastian Cole stood up. No invitation, no permission. Judge Dominic Hayes furrowed his brow. The defense attorney shook his head, about to intervene, but Sebastian had already stepped into the center of the courtroom. False evidence, 2 words, slicing through the room like a blade. Every head turned. Sebastian didn't flinch. He held up papers, edges crumpled and water-stained, an ATM security still, a GPS log, an original message that had never made it into evidence. This is where my brother was at 9:42 p.m. This is the receipt from a store 4 miles from the crime scene. This is the message confirming he was meeting someone. Ignored. He presented each piece like he'd rehearsed 100 times, because he had, on borrowed desks in sleepless nights, whispering to himself until the truth became muscle memory. The defense attorney rose slowly, face stiff with disbelief. Reporters stopped scribbling. Someone pulled out a phone and began recording the moment. And Judge Hayes? He said nothing. His face had gone pale. His hand hovered over the gavel, but he couldn't bring it down. Silence fell over the courtroom. In that moment, it wasn't Sebastian who was heard. It was the entire system that was forced to listen. A 16-year-old boy, no title, no power, but armed with the truth. And for the first time, after months of denial, the truth finally had a voice. Sebastian wore a worn-out suit, the kind stitched together in a rush from a thrift shop off Brooklyn Heights Row, the neighborhood where he and Gabriel lived with their grandmother. It didn't make him look sharp, but when he stepped out of that courtroom, holding the documents that silenced an entire room, people couldn't help but turn and look. By morning, headlines blazed across newspapers in southern Newbridge. Teen saves brother with the truth. The front page showed a black and white photo. Sebastian, holding up the evidence, eyes rimmed with red, but head held high. That moment sparked a movement. A group of law students launched an online forum, dissecting every detail of the case. One attorney, who had previously declined to even review the file, called personally to apologize, then offered to represent Gabriel pro bono in the appeals process. Judge Hayes quietly came under judicial review. The case was reopened. Gabriel's life sentence, suspended, pending reinvestigation. The very community that once turned away began mailing letters to Sebastian's home, not to praise him, but to apologize. One of his former teachers broke down in tears watching him on TV. She had once told him, "You can read all the books you want, but you'll never beat the system." Now she knew she was wrong. In a world where trust had long been shattered by prejudice, it was the smallest gestures, a nod, a handshake, a public apology, that slowly began to stitch hope back together. When the judge slammed the gavel, mocking laughter erupted from the back rows. But in Sebastian's eyes, something flickered that no one saw. A silent vow. That day, he didn't cry. He didn't say a word. But in that very silence, justice began to be rewritten. not by power, but by the sheer will of a 16-year-old boy. 2 years later, at a forum held at Langford Law School, Sebastian, now a freshman, stood before hundreds, recounting his journey. Someone in the audience asked, "What do you think changed everything?" He smiled, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a crumpled indictment paper, its red mark still visible. False evidence. The ink had faded, the corners were torn, but it still spoke louder than any title ever could. "I'm not a lawyer," he said. "I didn't go to Harvard. I don't come from power, but I'm proof that justice doesn't belong to the privileged. It belongs to those who never stop fighting for it." The room erupted in applause, not because it was a perfectly crafted line, but because it was raw and real, and no one could deny its truth. And somewhere else, in a holding cell at Phoenix Ridge, Gabriel Vaughn sat down to write his first letter to his brother. It began, "You saved me, not with force, but with the faith I had forgotten to hold on to." Beneath the barred window, the evening light streamed in, a quiet reminder that some promises, no matter how broken, can be rebuilt. Even trust, even hope, even justice. No one knew that Sebastian had read every single law book in the Holleridge Public Library, the only place that never turned him away because of his skin color. While other kids his age were out playing ball, Sebastian Cole, the quiet black boy with downcast eyes and an oversized jacket, sat silently at a wooden table by the window, devouring legal codes like someone trying to save a drowning soul. At night, after his grandmother fell asleep, he'd borrow her old typewriter and teach himself how to draft appeal letters. He'd write one, then tear it up, write another, rip it again. More than once, his fingers bled from pounding the keys too hard, but he never stopped. One night, long after the courtroom had faded from public memory, Sebastian quietly made his way to the old parking lot behind City Hall, searching for a camera no one had paid attention to. He dug through outdated parking logs, cross-checked timestamps from card swipe receipts, the only sliver of proof that Gabriel Vaughn wasn't at the scene. He didn't have access to official records, but when he found a tampered report, its timestamp subtly altered, he knew that was the key. He compiled the evidence, typed up his findings, and mailed them everywhere he could, only to have them returned with a single line. Not a legal guardian. But instead of giving up, Sebastian made a decision. He would speak for himself, stand in front of the court, uninvited, unqualified, unbelieved. Because to him, the truth didn't need credentials, only courage. Ever since Gabriel was arrested, Sebastian Cole stopped going to school. Not out of despair, but because he couldn't sit through a civics and freedom class while his brother sat behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Each morning, he'd sneak into the old print shop at the corner of Maplewind Avenue, asking for leftover paper scraps. He'd take them home and handwrite appeal letters, because his grandmother's printer had long since stopped working. Ink pens ran out faster than he expected, so he switched to pencils. He wrote, erased, rewrote, and sometimes he cried. One day, while hiding near the courthouse cafeteria, he overheard two attorneys chatting. One casually mentioned that the security camera behind the Goldbridge building, the very lot where Gabriel was supposedly caught, had mysteriously lost signal for exactly 17 minutes. No one, it seemed, had ever reviewed that footage. That night, Sebastian snuck back to City Hall, crept through the fire escape, and searched for the camera. He couldn't access the footage, but he photographed the model number and installer's logo. The next morning, he mailed a handwritten request to the company and waited 11 days. Then a wrinkled envelope arrived. Inside was a technical report. Camera signal disruption due to manual override. Sebastian froze. He knew. This was it. Proof someone had deliberately concealed evidence. No one had guided him. No one had believed him. But now he held in his hands something no one else in that courtroom did. The truth. Attorney Everett Sinclair, the man assigned to defend Gabriel, never truly believed a 16-year-old black boy could do more than scribble out notes riddled with spelling mistakes. But he didn't stop him either. Maybe, just maybe, he saw something in Sebastian's eyes that the courtroom had long forgotten. A faith that refused to die. Then came the day no one expected. At the retrial, everything looked the same. Judge Dominic Hayes tapped his gavel with tired indifference. The jury, once again a sea of white hair and folded arms, nodded slowly as if the outcome had already been etched in stone. But Sebastian? He was no longer hiding in the back row. He walked forward, alone. No name called, no permission granted. "Objection!" one prosecutor shouted, but Judge Hayes raised a hand, because Sebastian had already spoken. 2 words, just 2, and the room froze. "False evidence!" He reached into his bag. Out came the copies, the official reply from the security company, and a certified voice recording. He laid them out one by one, steadily without a tremble. Each page, each image, each sentence was a stone hurled at the glass walls of so-called justice. Reporters stopped writing. Cameras turned toward him. And when Sebastian played the voice message, the one that proved Gabriel was miles away at the time of the crime, a tear slipped from Everett Sinclair's eye. Not out of emotion, but out of realization. The boy he had dismissed had done what an entire legal system wouldn't dare do. He stood up and forced the truth to be heard. Detective Nathaniel Sterling, the man who had once beaten a false confession out of Gabriel in a locked interrogation room, had roamed free for 3 years. No charges, no suspension. Because, as one of his fellow officers had once let slip, the victim's just another black kid. But this time things were different. When the retrial made front-page news, a local paper, the Holleridge Chronicle, ran a headline no one expected. "Boy saves his brother, and now the system listens." The cover photo captured Sebastian standing outside the courthouse, case file in hand, eyes burning with quiet resolve. It went viral. Hashtags spread like wildfire. #, Justice for Gabriel. #, Believe Sebastian. Just days later, Gabriel Vaughn's sentence was officially suspended, clearing the way for an internal investigation into Sterling's violent misconduct. It was only a step, but it was the first real breath of justice. As for attorney Everett Sinclair, the man who once saw Sebastian as nothing more than the defendant's little brother, he approached the boy after court. He didn't say a word, just placed a hand on his shoulder and bowed his head. It was the first time in 10 years of practicing law that he felt he was truly standing on the side of justice. And so, in a small kitchen on Brooklyn Heights Row, 3 generations shared dinner together. Sebastian's grandmother, Gabriel home at last, and the 16-year-old boy who had made the whole world listen. No titles, no degrees, just the truth. And one voice that refused to stay silent. In a cramped upstairs room of an old walk-up on Brooklyn Heights Row, Sebastian Cole hunched over a worn wooden desk, the soft amber glow of a flickering lamp casting shadows across his untrimmed curls. No printer, no computer, just a pen, a few school notebooks, and a heart that refused to surrender. Line by line, he wrote his rebuttal by hand, through the night, through the cold wind that slipped in from a cracked window latch. His grandmother was asleep in the next room, and Gabriel, the brother he believed in with everything he had, was just 3 blocks away, locked behind bars. When his hand trembled from exhaustion, Sebastian paused, flipped to the last page, and wrote a single sentence in bold, deliberate strokes. "Justice does not require power. It only requires persistence." The next morning, when he walked into court, he carried nothing but a bundle of handwritten documents, tied together with a worn rubber band. But inside that bundle was everything: the timeline, the evidence, the truth, and a boy who refused to let justice be warped by power and prejudice. And when the hearing ended, when the crowd filtered out and the last sliver of daylight touched the rusted sign that read, "Marblegate Courthouse," a young reporter turned back and asked, "Are you planning to study law?" Sebastian looked up and smiled, softly but deeply. "No, I don't need to become a lawyer, because sometimes it takes an outsider to speak the truth without fear." He documented every inconsistency, every flawed statement, every overlooked detail, not to prove he was smart, not to impress anyone, but to save the one person who had once stood between him and a bully, Gabriel Vaughn, his brother. Each night, while the city slipped into sleep, Sebastian would switch on his desk lamp and revisit old news reports, blurry crime scene photos he'd secretly downloaded from the library's public computer. Without any forensic software, he used a red pen to circle every frame, footprints that didn't match, cameras angled the wrong way, and most importantly, the statement of the sole witness, a man who had changed his story after a closed-door meeting with Officer Sterling. Some nights his hands went numb, fingertips raw and bleeding from gripping the pen too tightly. His grandmother would gently call him to bed, but Sebastian would whisper back, "I have to finish. If no one else believes in Gabriel, then I'll believe enough for the whole world." And he kept going. At just 16, he became the lead investigator on his family's case, with no training, no backup, no support. Only one thing guided him, the truth. And taped to the center of his bedroom wall, surrounded by scribbled notes and crooked diagrams, was a sentence written in bold, underlined ink. "Don't ask if the truth matters. Act like it does." He once walked into a law office, clutching the case file he'd printed from the public library, hoping someone, anyone, would listen. But the attorney took one look at him and said, "What could a 16-year-old black kid possibly know about the law?" They looked at him like a walking joke. He stood there, rain-soaked shoes, trembling hands, eyes fixed on the door that slammed shut in his face. Sebastian didn't argue, didn't flinch. He just turned around, quietly, slowly, pressing the damp file against his chest, and walked back to the tiny attic room on Gray Shore Lane. A room where the ceiling light had been dead for 3 weeks and his grandmother couldn't afford to fix it. He wrote by flashlight every night. That night she found him sitting still for hours. "Let it go, child," she whispered. "They'll never listen." He didn't answer, but in his head one sentence played on repeat. "If no one will listen, I'll make them listen." He kept going, without permission, without approval. He emailed dozens of journalists, slid documents under the doors of prosecutors' offices, and posted a heartfelt essay on a community forum titled, "If Justice Isn't for a 16-year-old Kid, then who is it for?" The next morning, one unexpected name showed up in his inbox. Clarice Wynn, an independent journalist, once threatened for exposing wrongful convictions. She didn't write much, just one line, "That boy deserves to be heard." And from that moment on, Sebastian wasn't alone anymore. One rainy night, Sebastian stood motionless in front of Northvale Courthouse, shoulders soaked, arms wrapped tightly around a case file that had grown thicker with each sleepless night. Streetlights shimmered across the wet pavement, distorted, cold. He didn't know where to go next. Everything felt stacked against him. The law, time, even hope seemed to waver. But in that moment of quiet despair, he whispered, not to anyone else, just to himself, a vow. "I won't let him sit in prison for something I know is wrong." No one heard it, but that vow would go on to rewrite a fate. The very next morning, Sebastian returned to Holleridge Library, the only place that never turned him away because of his skin. He checked out State Appeals Law, then another book, and 4 more after that. The librarian didn't ask questions. She simply placed a small paper-wrapped sandwich beside the stack. No one offered help, but no one stood in his way anymore. He took notes by hand, still couldn't afford to print. In a torn old notebook, he color-coded sections, sketched out diagrams of the crime scene, cross-referenced testimony with phone GPS logs, mapped out blind spots in the security footage. With the same hands that had once been dismissed, Sebastian began to reconstruct a truth that had been buried. No one expected it. A boy with no degree, no legal title, no voice, sparking a fight that grown men had long given up on. But Sebastian knew, to save his brother, he didn't need a miracle. He just needed to never give up. During the appellate hearing, as the judge raised his gavel to close the session, no one paid attention to the teenager in the back. The one in the threadbare suit, sleeves a little too long, shoulders slightly hunched. But then Sebastian stood up. His voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the quiet like a bell in a cathedral. "I have evidence, and I think you should hear it." The courtroom froze. A few murmurs rippled through the rows. Attorney Everett Sinclair sighed, but didn't stop him. The judge glanced over, ready to dismiss him with a smirk. But Sebastian stepped forward, hands trembling but eyes steady, carrying a thick stack of documents bound by a fraying piece of string. He opened the bundle, photocopies from a public computer, grainy but clear images from a convenience store camera 3 blocks from the crime scene. In the footage, Gabriel Vaughn could be seen helping an elderly woman push her cart through a market at the exact time of the alleged crime. A witness ignored because no one ever asked. A text message, unopened, now printed from carrier records that Sebastian had retrieved himself. A truth, buried, resurrected by hands no one believed in. After each piece of evidence, Sebastian looked up and met every gaze. The lawyers, the prosecutors, the judge. And in his eyes, a question burned louder than any shout. "Now do you still dare to look away?" And then he said just 2 words. "False. Evidence. No laughter. No motion." The reporters stopped writing. The clerk's hand froze mid-stroke. And the judge, the same man who once called him a kid who doesn't understand the law, blinked, but couldn't speak. Because when the truth is spoken by the one they never expected to have a voice, it echoes louder than any gavel in a courtroom built on prejudice. "False evidence." His voice was soft, but each syllable struck like a fist through the courtroom's polished silence. A journalist dropped her pen. The judge who once smirked didn't dare blink. Those who had chuckled at the start now sat stone still, afraid to even breathe too loud. Sebastian stepped forward and placed the documents on the table. Printed images, call logs, a signed letter from a forgotten witness. Each detail, once ignored, now laid bare. No shouting, no theatrics. Just the truth, presented by the only person willing to carry it to the end. And then, something no one saw coming happened. One of the 3 jurors, a middle-aged woman who'd remained silent throughout the trial, stood and asked to speak. She said she'd felt something was off from the beginning, but it was the boy's eyes, steady, unshaken, that made her realize silence was no longer an option. The next day, the state's largest newspaper ran a front-page headline, "Boy saves his brother. Truth didn't wait for the adults." Within 48 hours, Gabriel Vaughn's sentence was officially suspended. An internal investigation was launched, and Everett Sinclair, the attorney who had once dismissed the boy entirely, offered a public apology on live television. But none of that was what moved Sebastian most. Not the stay of sentence, not the headlines, not even the apology. It was what happened as he stepped outside the courthouse into the late winter breeze. A group of black school children waited at the steps. One boy, maybe 12, looked up at him and said, "You made us believe. We have a voice too. This report is falsified." Sebastian said it, his hand trembling slightly as he held the page, but his voice was steel. He stepped forward and laid each document in front of the panel. A time log off by nearly 10 minutes, while a nearby convenience store camera had captured Gabriel, blocks away, at the exact moment of the crime. Next came a text message from a delivery worker, a witness who had seen Gabriel waiting at the bus stop. He had contacted the police to testify, but was never called. Not once. And finally, a copy of an intake form from the detention center, documenting that Gabriel had been searched 40 minutes after the time of the alleged crime, meaning he was taken into custody before the victim had even been discovered dead. Not a single accusation could survive under the weight of those facts. The room froze. For the first time in the entire hearing, the judge took off his glasses and wiped his eyes with a bare hand. Jurors glanced at each other, stunned. Someone whispered, "Why didn't anyone check this before?" Sebastian didn't cry. He didn't need to, because in that moment, when he brought the truth into the light, he didn't just save his brother. He cracked open a system that had long fallen asleep on justice. At the back of the courtroom, a mother held her child a little tighter. A young lawyer bowed his head, and a 14-year-old black boy stood, slowly, and began to clap. Quiet, certain, and that was only the beginning. The entire courtroom, shaken. No one had ever witnessed anything like it, especially not from a 16-year-old boy. Reporters rushed out of the chamber, flipping through the very documents Sebastian had laid out. Hollowbrook News interrupted regular programming for a breaking bulletin. Teen presents evidence in wrongful conviction. Judge, police, and entire legal system under fire. Within days, an internal investigation was reopened. Detective Nathaniel Sterling, the man who coerced Gabriel into a false confession, was officially suspended. Judge Dominic Hayes, the same man who once smirked at Sebastian's first statement, was ordered to step down from all active criminal cases. A coalition of volunteer attorneys, many of whom had once ignored Sebastian's pleas, now returned, this time to stand by him through the appeals process. And then, the unimaginable happened. Gabriel Vaughn, once sentenced to life behind bars, was granted a stay of execution, not out of sympathy, but because the evidence, gathered by his little brother, was undeniable. Across social media, people began to share the story under a single banner: Number Justice by Courage. The North Vale Times ran the front page with a photo of Sebastian standing outside the courthouse in that same worn-out suit, hands clutching a trembling stack of papers. The headline, bold and clear: "The boy without a lawyer but with the truth." That day, the entire city paused to finally hear a voice that almost got silenced. Gabriel was granted a stay of execution. Right after the hearing, the case file was sealed, not to close it, but to open a new line of investigation. The courtroom still hadn't recovered from what had just unfolded. But one man, attorney Everett Sinclair, who had once dismissed the self-taught kid, walked quietly toward Sebastian. He didn't speak. He just stood there for a moment and bowed his head. Not because Sebastian had won, but because Sinclair now understood. No one had ever stood up to the entire system and stood their ground the way this boy had. Sebastian didn't smile. He simply nodded, eyes drifting toward the back row, where his grandmother sat, clutching a worn Bible with frayed edges. She was the first person to believe he wasn't crazy for saying he'd save his brother, and the only one who had written handwritten letters to Gabriel every single week for the past 18 months. That day, countless reporters requested interviews with Sebastian. He declined them all, except for one message sent to the North Vale Beacon. "I didn't do this to be seen. I just couldn't sit still while an innocent man paid the price. And if the justice system is a rusted machine, then maybe a kid can be the first drop of oil." Sebastian's story didn't just spread across North Vale. It broke through every boundary. Newspapers, television networks, law schools across the country. Everyone was talking about him, a new symbol of hope rising from the cracks of a system long rusted. They called it the reversal trial, but to him it was never about that. It was just a journey, from the quiet corner of a rundown library to the witness stand where he made a vow to justice. On a crisp autumn morning, when Gabriel was finally transferred out of solitary to await retrial, he turned to look at his little brother. No words were exchanged, just an embrace, tight, shaking, and silent. And in that hug, every unspoken promise, every sleepless night, every act of defiance finally found its voice. At the Community Justice Awards ceremony, the person receiving the highest honor wasn't a seasoned lawyer. It was a 16-year-old boy in a faded shirt and mismatched shoes. He stepped up to the mic and spoke only one sentence, short, steady, and enough to bring the entire room to its feet. "I'm not a lawyer, but I am proof that justice doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who refuse to give up." You've just heard the journey of one boy, but it could just as easily be the journey of any one of us. If this story sparks something in you, leave a comment below. Have you ever witnessed injustice or felt too small to change anything? And if you believe that justice needs more voices, don't forget to subscribe, so together we can keep the light shining on stories like this. Because light begins with a single spark, and sometimes that spark comes from a boy the world once refused to hear. Some battles don't begin with gunfire or grand revolutions, but with a boy sitting quietly in a library, flipping through worn pages, taking notes with a pencil ground down to the wood. Sebastian Cole had no power, no status, not even a lawyer willing to listen, but he had one thing no one could see: a belief that justice isn't a privilege, it's a right waiting to be reclaimed. This isn't just the story of clearing his brother Gabriel Vaughn's name. It's the story of how Sebastian rewrote his own place in a world that once pushed him to the margins. Through his mind, his persistence, and his quiet courage, he turned silence into evidence, prejudice into fuel, and a wrongful sentence into a wake-up call for an entire community. The lesson here isn't about a happy ending. It's about the choice to stand up, even when no one stands with you. Life won't always be fair, but fairness doesn't come from the system. It begins with the people who refuse to accept injustice. So wherever you are, whoever you are, never believe your voice is too small, because sometimes that voice is the only one brave enough to speak the truth.